Housing has garnered national attention in recent months. It's even been the subject of White House regulation.
President Trump signed an executive order aimed at stopping Wall Street investors from buying up single-family homes.
And it was a major part of the mayoral campaign of New York's Zohran Mamdani.
Let's talk about the housing crisis.
Meanwhile, Connecticut is in the middle of a legislative session. So what's happening with housing here in our state? From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we talk about the past and present of housing. Later in the show, we'll learn why the arson wave of the 1970s has long been misunderstood. But up first, Abigail Brown. She's housing reporter for Connecticut Public. Abby, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Before we talk about what's happening in Connecticut around housing, talk to us about why housing is so significant here in Connecticut.
Yeah, Connecticut's lucky in that I think we have two housing dedicated reporters, me being one, and the Connecticut Mirror has another. I think we're the only ones in the state. But it's a significant beat because, as you mentioned, it kind of touches on everything. I do stories that obviously are inherently housing, but they also collide with health, they collide with environment, children's issues. It's all over the spectrum. I mean, everyone, because at its root, everyone needs housing, right? So it's going to impact everyone in one way or another, which is, I think, rare for a subject matter.
I think it's also what makes this time in Connecticut so significant. As you said, everyone needs housing. Housing is connected to so many other policy areas. It affects everyone in the state, regardless of what part of the state they are in. And I think because of that, Abby, we are seeing so much, not just conflict, but also conversation about what's needed, what's possible, and what could happen. We are in the middle of the legislative session right now. There are a number of bills that have been approved by the legislature's housing committee moving on to the state. And there are a lot of people who are saying, even with that kind of movement, we need more. We need it more quickly. Talk to us about one of those key pieces of legislation, and that's related to what's called a just cause eviction law. What is that all about?
Yeah, so basically, current law in Connecticut, you being a landlord cannot evict a resident who is a senior or has a disability at the lapse or at the end of their lease. There has to be kind of more of a reason. They have to have violated the lease in some way or, been destructive to property, something like that. And there's a movement among tenants' rights activists and some lawmakers to expand that law to include everyone who lives in apartment buildings with 5 or more units, so bigger buildings. And that would mean that people who live in these apartments, when their lease expires, and a lot of these people are on month-to-month leases instead of annual, they can't be evicted unless, they've done something wrong, essentially. And the tenants' rights activists that are promoting this are saying that there are a lot of instances of people who have lived in the same building for sometimes decades suddenly being kicked out or evicted when a new owner comes in or when there is going to be remodeling and they want to really increase the rent and they know that tenant won't be able to afford it. So it's kind of just a tool that they're trying to use to increase tenant protections.
This is a law that is aimed at landlords in terms of shaping or restricting what they can do. And activists say this is to protect tenants. But I know that there's been a lot of debate about who is actually protected, about how effective this can be, and whether in trying to protect tenants, it makes it more difficult for landlords. I'm thinking about this, Abby, because Connecticut is a state where the cost of housing is astronomical for many
Mhm.
people, where the overall cost in this country, not just right now, but over some time, have made it more difficult for home ownership to be a possibility for people. So, on the one hand, you have more renters in a state like Connecticut, and on the other, you have this need to determine what can happen in terms of protecting those rights. Is there anything happening around landlords and what they can do given this kind of tension between the need for access and the need for protection? What about landlords in this?
Yeah, so I've spoken with several landlords and how they feel, particularly about just cause, but about this kind of general shift in Connecticut in recent years toward more tenants' rights. And they kind of say that, yeah, there's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be corporate landlords that come in and want to change everything, sometimes for the worse for residents. But a lot of landlords just want to make a living and create a comfortable home for their tenants. And a lot of them that I've spoken with, at least, are local landlords. They're people that live here in Connecticut and operate here in Connecticut and operate buildings here in Connecticut. And they say they're against a lot of these pushes to increase tenants' rights, as the unions say and as housing advocates say, because they say it'll make it harder for them to get their jobs done effectively. That expanding just cause would make it harder for them to create safe and comfortable environments because it'll be more difficult to get rid of potentially disruptive tenants, even if they haven't broken property or things like that. There's no other recourse, they say, for them to evict them or get rid of them.
That tension between what landlords need, what tenants need, and also this concern about government interference or government reach. We hear it from some of the tenants who say, we need more support around this. And you hear landlords saying, we need you to also support our right to make a living and to also make the best interest of our property. Abby, we are in an election year. It will be a key election for governor in the state. And so these bills that are coming up in the legislature are important. But I think a lot of people are also looking to see what Governor Lamont will have to say or what he will do in this. What are you hearing at the level of the governor when it comes to just cause evictions or that tension between tenants' rights and landlords' rights? What are we hearing from the governor?
There's been a shift, I think, since last year because he got in a bit of hot water when the debacle went down with the omnibus housing bill that was vetoed by him last year after the legislative session. There was a special session with this being kind of the main thing they wanted to work on. And ultimately, it was watered down and approved by him. And he got in a bit of trouble with that from a lot of his Democratic lawmakers because they felt like he was taking the teeth out of the bill, right? There has been a shift that I feel like I've noticed since then because I think he's recognized that housing is a major concern for Connecticut residents and voters. And it's something that could be detrimental to his reelection chances if he doesn't hit the right note. And this year, he actually recently came out in support of Just Cause, which I think is a first. Just Cause has been in the legislative session for the last couple of years trying to get it through. It's gotten pretty close. It just never crossed that finish line. And I think this year is the first year that he's pledged his support for it as well. Another new interesting development that he's brought about is he came up with what's essentially a rent cap bill, which is something that's been discussed in previous years, hasn't happened, but he's the one that brought it up. He is the one that, had his people write up this bill and bring it to the legislature. So I think that kind of shows that he is taking the issue of housing seriously and knows that it's going to be a key element in getting reelected.
We are in a state that has 169 towns that we know very well. And we are in a state where, because of sort of geographic location, urban density, the patterns of wealth within this state, those cities will be critical for anyone who wants to become governor or stay governor in this state. And so, as you said, given the backlash to the governor's decisions last year around housing, given the ways that organizing happened amongst tenants, amongst activists, amongst other groups who said, wait a minute, this could be an issue, I am very curious about, because again, it's not just about the governor's election. Many of those state legislatures are up for election as well. I'm curious about those two pieces of the just cause eviction legislation and the rent cap legislation. Abby, based on what you know, how likely is it that these provisions will pass, or will it just become something that we have to wait again to see what happens?
I think Just Cause has a pretty decent chance. Like I said, it's been in the ledge for several years now. It's gotten really close. Last year, it was in the same position where it had been approved by the committee, and it was just failed to be brought up on the floor when the full legislature was debating. They ran out of time, essentially, and there was a kind of a big push at the end of, this is the last day we can do it, and it didn't happen. But because of how close it was, I feel like that gives it kind of a leg up this year. It has that exposure that a lot of bills don't have that wind up dying in the legislature. So I feel like Just Cause does have a decent chance of passing. The rent cap is another situation. I'm not certain that that'll get through because there's a lot of backlash to that one as well. There's a lot of concern from lawmakers, developers, and landlords over how this will limit them, basically limit them being the landlords and developers. Their concerns are that if you can't increase rent when you buy a building, how are you going to be able to do the maintenance and upkeep that's needed? Just to say that the bill itself says that you can increase rent a bit more if you are planning to do significant renovations to the building within the first year of owning it. And it has to be significant. That has to be like tens of thousands of dollars worth of work per unit. So I don't know if that one's going to get through. That may be one of the ones that needs a couple more years of exposure and work on it before it gets enough people on board.
We're talking about housing. We're talking about sort of the ongoing tensions between renters and landlords and how government may play a role in that. I want to talk about a population that is also significant to some of these conversations, but may not be as represented in those particular two pieces of legislation. And that, Abby, is the unhoused community, which is growing in this state. We are coming out of what was an extremely cold winter, lots of extreme weather-related events that we expect to do even more. I'm based here in New Haven, which had several unhoused people sadly lose their lives because of exposure and other concerns. And it is raising a question across the state of Connecticut about what can be done, what should be done, and of course, as we always like to consider, what will be done during this legislative session. What are you seeing in the legislature when it comes to conversation or legislation related to unhoused populations?
Two things kind of stand out as pushes to address concerns, health, safety for unhoused residents. And one is the push to ensure that you can't be criminally penalized for being unhoused. As you may recall, in the last 2 or so years, there was the Supreme Court decision that basically allows municipalities to make it illegal to be homeless. And Connecticut, in response, tried to pass a law in the last legislative session saying that you can't make that illegal here in Connecticut. Towns can't do that. And that part did not get through. So that's another thing they're revisiting this year, is trying to ensure that towns can't pass these laws that make it illegal to just be sleeping outside, to be unhoused. They did manage to pass a bit last year about hostile architecture to ensure that people who are unhoused can actually use a park bench to take a nap in the middle of the night when no one else is using it.
Can you give us some examples of hostile architecture? Because it is a newer term, but it's certainly a long-standing practice. Give us a couple of examples of that.
Yeah. The kind of main one that sticks out to me is benches. You see it a lot in big cities, the types of benches where it's like a C and there's a bunch of bars in between each C and they're supposed to be armrests, or there's two bench seats and then there's a big gap, and designers will say, well, that's so someone who is a wheelchair user would be able to go in there. But really, and yes, that's true, of course, but it also would coincidentally prevent someone who's unhoused from being able to lay on that bench. Same thing with the armrests. So it's little things like that that kind of, if you're looking for it, you may notice it, but it's not super explicit unless you kind of know what to look for. So that's kind of the big one that sticks out, is these park benches. And it's cropping up a little more. So Connecticut tried to address that. Last year, they passed something about kind of restricting hostile architecture. So this year, they are trying again to get the push for actually ensuring people can't be penalized for being unhoused. The other thing that I recently wrote about, which is interesting, and we'll see if this comes to fruition. You know, in the legislative process, there are bills in certain years where you just kind of have to raise awareness for an issue more than actually get the bill approved. There's so many bills that are proposed every year. And it may come back. So we'll see if this one actually comes to fruition. But it's a bill that is trying to kind of streamline the emergency response system, particularly pertaining to unhoused residents in extreme weather. Because, as you mentioned, there were several people, more than 20 this year, that died from the extreme cold that we had this winter, and they were unhoused. And similar, in the summer, there's always people that are getting really sick because it's really hot and they have nowhere to go to cool off. So there's a bill that just passed recently, the Public Health Committee, that said we need to kind of streamline and solidify a process to address emergency response when we have heat waves, when we have cold snaps. And that's particularly addressing the unhoused population and trying to ensure we have shelters that get set up lickety-split when we know there's a heat wave coming. So we'll see what happens with that one, but that's something that's kind of a newer subject, is addressing this extreme heat along with extreme cold, because that's been a more longstanding thing.
I think you have just shown us, Abby, why housing is so important and how it's so nested in all of these other things, as we are talking about climate patterns and what it can mean for us here in the Northeast, when we are talking about access and availability to public spaces. I'm thinking here of the important role of libraries often that can serve as warming centers for people and cooling centers. And in some ways, librarians serve as first responders because they are able to see and intervene and often need much more support to just do the basic job that they are asked to do, but they become community providers in these other spaces. As we round out our time, let's talk about something that is a little more quirky and perhaps not as serious, but is still important when we think about housing here in Connecticut. You recently reported on a very small town in the state that has 6 different zip codes. Tell us about that story.
Yeah. So it's the town of Scotland, which is over by the Rhode Island border. It's like a little bit above New London. And they are very small. They have less than 1,600 residents. I went there and I met with some town officials. They told me, just to kind of paint a picture of how tiny this town is, there's one blinking stoplight. There is a single store, which is a liquor store. There are more cows than human residents of this town. And they happen to be at this weird intersection that has 6 zip codes. And it sounds like, oh, well, that would be annoying, right? And it is, but it's also kind of more than annoying. It's become like a big issue that a lot of people in the town deal with every day. So I first heard the story in just a small press release from Chris Murphy's office, Senator Chris Murphy. They said, Murphy's going to be proposing a bill to try and consolidate these zip codes. It's something that has to be done kind of on the federal level because this town has advocated for a consolidation with the USPS for several years, and they've been given no response, basically. So the issue, though, with the 6 zip codes is more than you'd expect. It's caused the typical stuff of missing mail, packages not getting delivered, but it's caused people to get incorrect death certificates for loved ones. It's taken months in some cases for people to get a correct death certificate because their mailing address is not the same as their street address. It's caused children to attend the wrong school for months because their street address says they're supposed to be in one town and they live in Scotland. And then months into the school year, they find out, oh, you're not actually supposed to be here. Same thing with birth certificates. So it's caused more of a ruckus than you'd think. So I just kind of wrote a story about why is this the case? When the USPS made the zip code system in the 60s, they just kind of fell in this middle ground. And now there's a push to consolidate the zip codes. USPS is not a fan. They say it'll just kind of make their jobs harder, that zip codes aren't determined by actual town lines. It's just kind of the flow of the mail and what makes sense to them. It's going to be at least a year before we find out what is going to become of the zip code bill. But it was a really interesting story.
I think it's an amazing story that captures so much of why housing is important when we think about not just what's happening in a town, but the relationship between that town and the federal government, who's advocating for whom, what's happening, and all of the ways that we're thinking right now about IDs and passports and access to voting and access to education. This is a story that really highlights that. So to our listeners in the great town of Scotland, we are rooting for you to get what you need, and we are grateful that you are bringing these stories to us. Abigail Brown is housing reporter for Connecticut Public. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll correct the record on the history of arson in American cities.
The 70s arson wave was far more destructive and more protracted than the uprisings of the 1960s, and yet it's the uprisings that are remembered.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about housing. Imagine it's 1977. You're watching the Yankees and the Dodgers play in the World Series when suddenly the video camera leaves Yankee Stadium and shows a massive fire burning in a nearby building.
That is a live picture, and obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City.
Though the announcers that night never actually said the Bronx is burning, the phrase is still associated with that game and that era. It encapsulated the arson wave that had swept U.S. cities in the 1970s. But just as the phrase is misremembered, so too is the reason for the arson. For years, the arson has been attributed to Black and brown people living in the neighborhoods that were targeted. But in reality, the majority of the arson was committed by landlords looking for an insurance payout. This became common because it's tied to the complexities of redlining, stereotypes, and the insurance industry. The truth about those fires is laid out in the new book, Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City. Bench Ansfield is author of that book and assistant professor of history at Temple University. Bench, it's so great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I love the podcast. I was actually one of your original listeners because I was living in Connecticut when it launched in, was it 2021 or 2020?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
thank
so it's
you
really
for
wonderful
that.
to be here with you.
It for me feels like this full circle moment to have you on the show. But before we talk about this important new book, you mentioned being in Connecticut. Share with our listeners your connection to this great state of Connecticut.
Yeah, Connecticut is what brought me out to the East Coast from Milwaukee, where I grew up. I went to Wesleyan University as an undergrad, and then I moved to Philly after college, but I came back to Connecticut 5 years later for grad school at Yale.
This new book that you have written, Born in Flames, explores a wave of arsons that swept through American cities in the 1970s. And most famously, you write about some of those arsons that happened in the Bronx. Talk to us about the origins of this book and how you first learned about this topic.
Yeah, so thank you for kind of locating me in space. I first learned about this history not in New York or the Bronx, but while I was living in Philly from a neighbor of mine, actually. This is the best way to learn about urban history is just talking to your neighbors. It was 2008. I had just graduated college right into the Great Recession, which was, of course, sparked by the subprime mortgage crisis. So I was very attuned and curious and confused about how the American real estate market could blow up the global economy, essentially. I didn't start researching the book for a number of years. The questions just kind of like lodged themselves in the back of my mind until I entered grad school. Partly, I went to grad school because of that recession and the disappearance of all decent jobs. And when I did start looking into it, I couldn't believe what I found. My neighbor in Philly wasn't exaggerating. This was a widespread phenomenon, and it was a national phenomenon. It wasn't just the Bronx. And it took me over a decade to do all of the archival research and the interviews and oral histories to write the book. And a lot of that was spent really just following the money in the insurance markets. And I recognize that maybe it's different talking about insurance to a Connecticut audience, but generally when I start talking about insurance, people's eyes glaze over. Like nobody typically wants to think about insurance any more than is absolutely necessary. Like that's in some ways the business plan of the industry. You buy insurance so you don't have to think about something. But that was, the more I thought about it, the more I started to see it everywhere in all of these different ways that it shapes our lives and our landscapes, our neighborhoods, even our relationships. And I think it's actually really an important thing to be analyzing and studying and talking about.
One of the real strengths of this book is this reminder that although the focus is on the 1970s when these arsons were so widespread, it really dates back to context out of the 1960s and beyond, and the ways in which sometimes these things unfold over time in terms of people realizing what's possible, but that the effects can be enduring for those communities who are vulnerable. Talk to us more about the history of how people can understand these fires that were occurring in the 70s.
The major myth that I'm kind of going to war with in the book is this idea that the fires of the 1970s were just, quote, people burning down their own neighborhoods, which is this narrative residue, I think, from the rebellions of the 1960s, right? There's this real tendency in popular memory and in the scholarship, in the actually written histories that we have, to allow the sort of intense brightness, the sort of luminosity of those 60s uprisings, to allow that to obscure the wave of landlord arson of the 1970s. If you see a burnt out building in a city like Hartford or Newark, the story goes it was probably the outcome of those mass uprisings of the 60s or the early 70s. And actually, that was what I was taught in Milwaukee when I was growing up, right? But actually, a vacant lot in an American city is much more likely to have been the outcome of this arson wave of the 1970s, that it was actually the outcome of not protest, but profit. The 70s arson wave was far more destructive and more protracted than the uprisings of the 1960s. And yet it's the uprisings that are remembered, not these landlord torch fires. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be thinking about and memorializing the uprisings of the 60s. They're immensely important in how American history has proceeded. But to do that sort of memorialization at the expense of, this other phenomenon, right? These landlord torch fires, I think it's actually very telling about historical memory and what gets remembered and what gets forgotten.
And I think it also benches the ways that people can justify behaviors, particularly punitive behaviors,
Hmm.
based on that narrative of, look at all of the progress we made with policy and laws in the 60s, and now this is what people are doing. So it gets used to justify this law and order crackdown approach. What role then does stereotype play, not just in the memory, but the narrative that is told to justify why certain neighborhoods and communities are not worthy of investment or not worthy of protection? What did you find in your research?
Yeah. So even while this was happening, even in the early 1970s, as you begin to see this uptick of landlord torch fires, it was common among intellectuals, among policymakers, and pundits to blame the rising fire rate on vandalism or riots or pyromania, all of which were projected onto Black and brown communities. And that's a move that was actually made most famously by presidential aide Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1970 in this memo that he wrote to then President Richard Nixon, where he literally said that fires were endemic. That's the word he used, endemic to Black neighborhoods, right? He's saying essentially that they're a natural outcome of the cultural pathologies that he's projecting onto Black communities. And those stereotypes had real material consequences, right? For the landlords who wanted to exploit these neighborhoods, those stereotypes offered them really an alibi, right? An alibi that allowed them to get away with these acts of exploitation without anybody really asking, why are there so many fires, right? This is the thing about fire is you can't hide it, unlike another kind of misdeed that a landlord would do, an eviction, an illegal eviction, for instance. Fires are actually visible to all, right? They create smoke. They should prompt the question, why is that fire happening, right? What is the cause? And yet, these cultural pathologies, these stereotypes that are projected onto Black and brown neighborhoods were so powerful that question, the question of why, didn't even need to be asked. And it impacts not just how people are responding in the moment, but also how people are remembering this. So back to this idea of historical memory, the assumption of Black and brown criminality was so powerful, so self-evident, that it has totally obscured this fact of exploitation, this fact of dispossession, so much so that all these decades later, the impression that Bronxites burn their own neighborhoods down, right? The Bronx is burning. That idea endures, and the vast fortunes that were made at the expense of the tenants of the Bronx have been forgotten. And instead of there being a concerted set of policies to correct the dynamics that led to this exploitation, instead what the Bronx gets and what other American cities get is a crackdown by police, right? Broken windows policing actually comes out of this history, that the actual physical broken windows of the Bronx, those were used by the criminologists who first proposed broken windows policing to, put forward their theory and really to scare other American cities and threaten them to say, you too will become the Bronx if you don't embrace this theory of policing. And what broken windows policing ends up doing is enabling mass incarceration, enabling kind of this blank check to be written to police precincts across the nation. And the Bronx is really key to how that process unfolds.
Coming up, more with historian Bench Ansfield. They'll tell us about the way that the arson wave of the 1970s affected individuals.
It was common for parents to put their children to bed with their clothes on, with their shoes on, so that they could make a quick escape in the middle of the night.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring the past and present of housing policy. We're still joined by Bench Ansfield, Assistant Professor of History at Temple University and author of Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City. Before the break, we were talking with Bench about the wave of arson in U.S. cities that occurred in the 1970s. Apartment fires were often blamed on communities of color who were living there, even though the fires were most often set by landlords. Here's more of our conversation, and a note that this conversation was recorded before Zohran Mamdani won the election for mayor of New York City. I want to pull out a line that you said, this is not about protest, but profit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Benj, some people may be listening to our conversation and thinking, is this about a political strategy to pathologize these communities, as you said? And, you mentioned the growth of mass incarceration, which is a profit-generating, revenue-generating system unto itself. But I think the finer point here is that this served a dual purpose. One, it allowed these landlords to generate profit at the expense of the pain of the people who lived in these communities and commit fraud in some ways. But it also helped endear those landlords to a system of power that made it so they could benefit and profit in many ways and create, dare I say, a sort of caste system of who could fight back, who could resist, and what the consequences were. So do you see that political and that profit intertwined? Or did this start for landlords as I need to make money, and then it was used by people like Moynihan to exploit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a danger in viewing this history as a conspiracy. I mean, there were actually these arson rings with deep benches, dozens of people involved, not just landlords, but also insurance adjusters and cops, and of course the people that the landlords hired to do the burning, who were called torches. But I argue that actually this isn't so much a whodunit in the way that true crime would kind of imagine. It's more of a whatdunit, right? What are the processes that put this in place? What enabled this really widespread, really sweeping process of dispossession to play out for over a decade? And it wasn't a conspiracy. It was these systems of thought, systems of power, and the immense power that landlords wield over the lives of their tenants and how unchecked that is, right? Yes, they were able to get away with this because of these racial pathologies that are, being spouted from on high by the likes of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But they're, often these landlords are making kind of a pretty, economists would call it a rational economic choice, right? They find that they can simply make more money by burning their building than by renting it out or by selling it. And it's trying to understand those economic choices and how they interplay with these processes of racialization. That's really where the work of the book is.
When I was reading the book and remembering how not just Daniel Patrick Moynihan's work, but this wave of arson, yes, it affected neighborhoods and communities and cities, but the legacies of that are enduring in terms of the generational wealth that can be produced by ownership or
Yes.
being able to have a say in where you and your family choose to live, as opposed to having that decided for you, whether it's through redlining with banks and lenders or the ways that certain communities are permanently branded as inferior because of this history. And I also, Bench, in reading this book, thought, this is really difficult history to dig into because although it's the beauty of history, although it happened in the past, it is so present with us today.
Yes.
Were there particular stories that stood out to you that made you say, this is why we need to tell this story and keep telling these stories even today? What stood out to you?
The one really common detail that has haunted me since I first read it in an archive 10 years ago, and that I kept stumbling upon this detail, was that it was common for parents to put their children to bed with their clothes on, with their shoes on, so that they could make a quick escape in the middle of the night. They had a suitcase packed by the door. And to really imagine like the mindset of putting your kid to bed, wearing their street clothes. I mean, that's if you really take that in, it breaks your heart, right? I mean, it's really imagine living in that state of precarity, and that's what it took to stay alive, right? It required a sort of vigilance. I think of it as like a bruising vigilance. It's the kind of vigilance that like you can't actually cultivate without in some level hurting yourself, right? It's living through this constant threat. And that's really what it was, because it was common for families to get burned out, not just once, but multiple times, right? They would be essentially evicted by fire and then move somewhere else, be relocated somewhere else, and then the exact same process would play out again, basically because there was nowhere to run. These entire areas were being burned out. And I mean, it's pretty difficult to concisely describe or to measure the toll of the arson wave. I mean, it destroyed countless lives. It's severed communities. It broke apart communities. 500 people died of arson annually throughout the 1970s. Many of them were actually firefighters, but that death toll actually was not as high as it could have been. I mean, considering in the Bronx, there were 30 fires every night, 30 fires a night, so when you think about, if you add that up over a decade, I mean, 500 people dying in a year is actually lower than maybe you would have thought. And the reason that number was lower is the landlords weren't trying to actually kill people. They found ways to tip off tenants, slipping a note under the door, or relying on the rumor mill to do its work. But again, that comes back to this vigilance that's required to stay alive, right? Which I think is actually one of the. I mean, it's what galvanized me to write the book, and it's that kind of detail that I think will never stop haunting me. And just one more thing is that I've had survivors of this history who were themselves children at the time come up to me after reading the book and say, like, we didn't know why our parents were putting us to bed with our clothes on. We thought that they were like being bad parents, and didn't realize until reading this that they were actually trying to take care of us, that they were trying to keep us alive, which, I mean, it gives me chills even now thinking about that. And it's just totally devastating to consider.
Hearing you voice that racial terror
Mm-hmm.
that generations were exposed to, the generational trauma of thinking your parent or your family or your caregiver who's just trying to keep you safe and alive, thinking that they were a bad parent.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of reflection at this point in one's adult life to say, no, they were doing the best that they could, I think Bench helps us to ask ourselves what accountability looks like, to ask ourselves, what do we collectively owe to these communities who were terrorized? And to my understanding, people were not held accountable or to account for this. And especially in a place like the Bronx in New York City, where people revere first responders like firefighters, the ways that their well-being was put at risk and harm for someone else's profit. I am embarrassed that more people don't know these situations and these stories, while also realizing the intentional ways that the narrative is manipulated to justify a process. When you think about your work, yes, you are an historian. Yes, you are a phenomenal professor. And at the end of the day, you are a person who steps into this arena and has to hold space for all of those complexities. What is it that you hope will come out of this book and not just the stories, but the reminders that it contains? What's your hope for the work?
The kind of bombshell revelation that I had early in the research was that public housing was untouched by arson, and almost singularly so. So you would have blocks in the Bronx where nearly every building was devastated by the fires except those that were owned by the state, right? Which is a really different takeaway about public housing in the late 20th century than almost everything else that's been written about it, right? In which, public housing and state subsidized housing is always and everywhere just a failure, right? A failure that needs to be torn down and redeveloped, which was indeed what urban policy has been since the 70s, that really accelerated since the 90s. And the federal government down to municipalities have turned their back on public housing since this moment, since the 1970s. But that assumption that public housing was a failure is really problematized by this finding that the greatest defense that a building could have was public ownership, right? The safest place to be was public housing in this sense, right? And that fact, that data point is very clarifying. And I see it as the ultimate support for what the tenant movement, the housing justice movement, has been demanding for years now, which is that we need to reinvest in permanently affordable and well-resourced social housing of some sort, right? That the private market is not capable of meeting the demands of housing in 2025, right? We see this in innumerable ways today. We see this in the skyrocketing rates of houselessness. We see this in how common eviction is, how common foreclosure is. The Zoran Mamdani campaign in New York City is running on this idea of reinvesting in social housing, and it's proven to be immensely popular. And I see that, this data point from this story as being the sort of like ace in the hole for that argument. It's very vindicating to find that public housing is immune to these pressures that the market can place on housing, right? And actually can be a stabilizing force. So I hope that actually it encourages more of that.
I think your work encourages us to think about the numerous ways that the decisions we make can affect people not just today, but for generations. How our action and our inaction on these matters can also fuel different processes that maybe are unintended, but have no less of a demand for us to pay attention to. And the real power of this book, Bench, is that you remind us not to take what we think we know for granted, but to always ask that why, that what. And then also remember that how we move forward depends on our ability to interrogate these difficult pieces of history that the remnants are with us today. And so we are so grateful that you are with us on Disrupted. Bench Ansfield is assistant professor of history at Temple University. Their new book is Born in Flames, The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City. Thank you, Bench.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking with you.
This episode was produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. Special thanks to our interns Davina Corderu and Megan Rodriguez Hawkins. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.